Good morning, everyone. I'm Sabrina Siddiqui. I'm a political reporter at The Guardian. And while we're setting up, I'll at least take this moment to say thank you all for being here. And also thanks to Brookings for hosting this very fascinating discussion. I'm thrilled to have some really great panelists join me on stage. And so let me just not necessarily get into their bios, which you have in your packets, because I know you want to hear from them and what they have to say, but at least introduce them. So I have Dr. Mildred Garcia, who is the president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. We have Jasmine Hicks, who is the National Field Director for Young Invincibles, and the Honorable Ilhan Omar, who is a representative in the Minnesota House of Representatives. We've obviously heard some very fascinating research that I think dispels the many stereotypes about the millennial generation, and it's pertinent because just yesterday there was actually a new survey out by NBC News and Generation Forward, which suggested that millennials care a great deal more about policy than they do about politics, and by a whopping 22-point margin, they feel that the efforts of organizations and groups who work within communities can do more to affect change in this country than politics and elections. And so I think that having a discussion like this will help us understand not just the barriers and the challenges that millennials face, and for us to be able to break those down amongst key demographics, but also to identify some solutions, which I'm sure all of you would like to hear as well. First, I just want to give everyone an opportunity to break the ice, to just react to some of what we heard this morning. What did you think were some of the most pertinent findings in your view? And we can start with you, Millie.
For me, it definitely is how diverse the millennials are and how they are going to be the students and leaders and citizens who are going to break the barrier and change. And being a baby boomer, I remember that era when we were talking about change. And it will be the millennials that will take this country to the next level. And to me, that is the most fascinating thing. And that they're all over the country, not just in New York City or San Antonio or Los Angeles.
Yeah, for me, definitely the diversity of millennials, and because of that diversity, we face a lot of different issues like student debt. But I think at the end, the optimism. We're facing a lot of issues as millennials, but we are very optimistic about positive change for the future.
I was struck by, and I think it reinforced my belief that this generation is truly a bridge generation. Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I come from, there is a high population of millennials who who are in the white category, but we're seeing a rise of new young electeds who are of minority backgrounds, and it just was a reaffirmation that this generation does not see some of those challenges and recognizes that we are able to surpass that and elect people who we think reflect our values, not our race or gender.
So one thing that this report does is it dispels many of the commonly held views about millennials, for example, that they don't all, in fact, live in Brooklyn and San Francisco, and they're not all spending more money than they have on avocado toast. This is, as you know, the most diverse generation in U.S. history. We're talking about a generation that is now 44% minority. So Ilhan, I'll ask you first, because you are the first Somali American Muslim elected to office in the United States. You're also a millennial. So in what way do you see your generation as shaping U.S. politics, both locally and nationally? And do you believe that the political institutions in this country are adapting to a more diverse future electorate?
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. That's a really good question. Thank you all for being here and for us having the opportunity to have this discussion. I was elected as the first Somali legislator in the country in 2016, and I actually am. Thank you. Absolutely. Defeating a 44-year incumbent, and And I actually came in to the DMV area this past weekend to join a cohort of 19 young electeds from diverse backgrounds in gender, in ethnicity, who are representing their communities locally, who came here to form America's cabinet as part of the Young Electeds Network. And we're seeing our generation sort of not waiting for permission to be invited to the table, but taking initiative in representing the communities that we live in. And I know right now with politics, there's a lot of dysfunction and toxicity, and we are sort of saying we have solutions to offer. A lot of the policies that are coming forth in the politics of our nation today is going to have a greater impact on our future and the future of the children we are raising. And so it is important for us to be part of those conversations. And I think a lot of the older generations and politicians that came before us are sort of feeling the heat. They're recognizing that not only are we going to be running for their seats, not only are we going to be showing up in those boardrooms, but we also are going to be proposing policy ideas. And so a lot of them are starting to think about ways that they can create space and mentorship. And I think, earlier to your point about millennials, seeing themselves as a generation of ideas. We see ourselves as organizers, and we see ourselves as being part of a grassroots movement that not only shapes things on the top, but it's also shaping things on the bottom. And I think that in itself is going to contribute to the kind of America that all of us were promised.
Jasmine, the Young Invincibles is directly focused on how public policy affects millennials. And in your work, what would you say are some of the greatest barriers and concerns that you have seen facing the millennial generation, which is your generation, and how do they differ across the various geographies in which you work?
Yeah, so the data presented in the report definitely reflects a lot of the concerns that millennials are facing. And as the field director at Young Invincibles, I get to put an actual face and talk to a lot of the young adults that are facing these issues. So Young Invincibles was actually founded in 2009 around the healthcare debate because the founders found that there was a healthcare debate going on, but there was also a recession, and a lot of their friends were graduating and not being able to get jobs that had healthcare benefits. So it was like, if you were a millennial and you didn't get a job with health insurance, what were you gonna do? You couldn't go home and be on your parents' health insurance if you weren't in school. So there was definitely a place for young adults at the table in this conversation. And they became, or led they were at the forefront of the under 26 provision of the healthcare law. So then from there, we just found that there was a natural niche for young adults being at the table and speaking up on policies that affect us. And we've continued to do this, and a lot of that data reflects some of the concerns. So healthcare is still a concern for a lot of young adults. Through the ACA, over 8 million millennials were able to access healthcare. But in this current environment, we could potentially lose healthcare again. Nationally, there's $1.4 trillion of student loan debt that millennials mostly are holding on to. So that surpassed credit card debt. It's only second to mortgage debt. So think about that. We're living in these high-cost cities and where the jobs are, but we also have to pay our student loan debt. So as a result, we're pushing back home ownership, we're pushing back marriages, we're pushing back families because we can't afford it, as a lot of the millennials in here, I'm sure, can attest to. So not only that, we're also not making as much money as our parents did and have lower wages than the boomers. So what does that mean for our retirements? So those are a lot of the concerns for us. And with Young Invincibles, I've been able to talk to young adults across the country who are facing these issues. So like last year, we had a young woman graduate from Howard, and she wanted to be an entrepreneur. And she said that she was able to because she could access healthcare. We've worked with young, low-income millennials who also have children who are benefits of CHIP, or Children's Health Insurance Program, that's currently, not being funded. So we worked with a young woman named Myra in Missouri whose son actually has cancer and he's on CHIP. So she's worried about not only the stress of a sick child, but how she's gonna continue to get him services and treatment. So again, these are a lot of issues that young adults are facing around the country, but in different states and in different areas, they look different and policies are looking different. So young people can continue to be at the forefront of different policies and pipelines that are implemented.
Thank you. And Millie, one thing that this report told us about was not just the diversity of the millennial generation itself, but also the increasing diversity of the generations that will succeed it. The post-millennial generation will be America's first majority non-white generation by the time that they reach adulthood. Has this reality hit the education system in the U.S.? What is the educational system and what are the institutions doing to prepare for what is truly an extraordinary shift?
Well, quite frankly, education is the vitality and viability of this country. If we do not educate millennials and post-millennials, this country will be in deep trouble. That's number one. Secondly, yes, it has hit educational institutions, especially public schools. That is where poor and diverse millennials are going to school. And when you look at the funding that is happening in states, it is varied across the country, and you're finding young people of color going to schools that don't have the resources that are necessary in order to have success with these children. And so it is varied across the country. Yes, it is a reality. It is especially a reality for public schools and public colleges and universities where the majority of millennials are entering because of the lower tuition and good programs. And so when you look at that, you see the problems that are happening, and yet there are some solutions, as you wanted to talk about. You see states like California actually focusing on the diversity. It is a majority minority state. And they're realizing that for California to progress, you have to have P12 working together with community colleges, working together with colleges and universities in the public system for seamless pipelines. You're seeing faculty and teachers sitting at the table working on promising practices, on what works with children from diverse backgrounds, cultural competency workshops, to understand this new population. May they be Vietnamese or Samoan or Tongan or from different Latin American countries. All Hispanics are not the same, and understanding the values. It's about going into the communities in which they live and speaking to families and parents in their language of how to get their children into the educational system and being successful with it. And then it's about having school systems that are welcoming environments where they can come and feel a part of it. I remember going to college and thinking that college was for rich people. It wasn't for me. And it was someone that reached out to me. And now with all of these millennials and all of these first generation and low income and students of color, we have to ensure that they feel that the atmosphere is the same. And public colleges and universities across the country are working together to look at student success and ensure that that is happening.
We've spoken a lot about some of the misconceptions, or we heard a lot about some of the misconceptions about millennials. And I think one thing that's important when you're trying to identify solutions is to also understand how stereotypes are formed. And so I would want to ask all of you, how do you think that stereotypes of millennials are formed? And also, what are some of the prejudices that you've seen firsthand for people who are part of this generational group? I'm happy to go ahead, Millie. Did you want to start?
Wow, that's a good one. let me go back to the student body that I was serving, which is over 40,000 students. It's a majority students of color. And the first thing is that that parents don't care about higher education, that really it's not important to them, that they're not going to work hard. I will give you an example where we had an educational fair which had partners, but not only throughout the entire K-12, private, public, community college. We had 109 community partners, and we called it Es el Momento, Educational Fair, partnered with Univision. Well, we got together in that partnership, and everybody that worked in that college fair spoke in Spanish. Everybody, as it walked through, it was like IKEA. Everybody who has been to IKEA knows that you have to stop at every stop to get the information. It started with P12. Then went into community colleges, then went to colleges and universities, and it ended with a FAFSA workshop in Spanish. The first year we did this in California, and it was at the campus I was at, Cal State Dominguez Hills, we had 1,000 people. We were expecting a small crowd. By the time I left 5 years later, we had 20,000 people coming to this fair. But it was a partnership, not only with education, with community partners, with corporations, and with Univision, which is the largest network and radio station in the country, giving messages out, radio, PBSs, everything was going on to ensure that it was out there. And then they came through and we did surveys. And we asked in Spanish at the end, and the one factor that came out was when families said, this was so important because I didn't need anyone to translate to me what it means to get my child into college and into a successful professional career.
I'd say the lazy millennial, right? Millennials are lazy. Everyone says that, but totally not true. A couple of years ago, I remember Representative Fox said, why can't millennials just work for the summer like I did and pay for college? But that's not possible. The average student loan debt is $30,000. So if I can make that in the summer and pay for my college tuition, I'm sure everyone would, right? That seems like an obvious solution. So I think the lazy millennial, even she recently said just last week that, aid systems are a hammock for young adults, that is just easy for us to get aid and use these types of services. So definitely the lazy millennial. Last week, one of our policy colleagues, he was on the Huffington Post Live with two other millennials, and they were talking about how they were working 2 and 3 jobs just to sustain a living and be in school and like nannying and picking up odd jobs. And what effects that has on you trying to study and do all these things, because as we know, like higher education is extremely important now. It's more important than ever, but it's also more expensive than ever. So how are we paying for that? We can't be that lazy, right? So I'd say that.
I think what I notice a stereotype just being, I think, for immigrants, and it sort of trickles down to everything that sort of impacts us, is the belief gap. There is a belief that we must not be that smart, depending on what ethnicity we have and where we come from, what part of the world we come from. I tell the story about being in my 6th grade math class, and the teacher sort of having this math problem that I could answer, raising my hand for about good 30 seconds, looking around, no other student with their hand raised, and eventually, because I didn't really speak English, but I knew how to solve this math problem, just getting up to that board, solving the problem, and sitting down with the shock and seeing the shock on the teacher's face as she realized that I was the only student in that classroom. And for a lot of us, in college campuses, in workplaces, there's a belief gap in where people don't think or believe that we are capable of contributing, we are capable of solving a problem, we are capable of being part of that conversation.
Ilhan, to follow up on that, because there are many people who may not know your story in this audience, and you came to the U.S. as a young girl after fleeing civil war. You temporarily resettled into a refugee camp. You obviously have a very extraordinary story that really illuminates the outsized role of immigration policy and how it has shaped both racial and ethnic diversity within this generation. So can you talk a little bit about your family's experience resettling in Minneapolis and how that has influenced and shaped your political life?
Yeah, so my family, I was born in Somalia, East Africa, and in 1990, when the Civil War happened, I was about 8 years old, and we fled into a refugee camp in Kenya, and eventually got an opportunity to settle in the U.S. in 1995. We started out in Arlington, Virginia, actually, and then this is where I went to middle school. When I came to the U.S., I didn't speak any English. The only two phrases I knew were hello and shut up. And as you could imagine, that set me up for a wonderful middle school experience. We eventually moved to Minnesota because at the time Minnesota had one of the best education systems. And my grandfather, my mother's dad, who had recently passed away, was very much excited about the idea of democratic government and participating in our democracy. He appreciated not, the way that someone who learns about, the founding fathers or anything like that appreciates, but as someone who knows what it feels like to grow up in the absence of it, appreciates it. And so in Minnesota, we have a thing called caucuses. It's a process that sort of kickstarts the election cycle every year, and there was one happening right across from the apartment building. We lived in Minneapolis, and my grandfather wanted to go, but he didn't speak English, and so I served as his language and cultural translator for this process. And being 14 years old, having just gotten accustomed to life in this country, I got really infatuated with this very infantile, messy process of our democracy, where people sort of come together, debate resolutions, elect and select someone to be their voice as a delegate, to eventually be part of endorsing a candidate, to run under their political banner. And so for me, that sort of began my love affair with politics and the party I eventually joined. But for my grandfather, this sort of put a damper in his dream, because for him, he envisioned this process being accessible, and for their generation, they sort of came here with the hopes of being part of this American life, an American dream, but there's all of these barriers that exist that doesn't really make it that accessible. And so for me, it became really important to create a process that was accessible for them so that they could fully participate. And my generation is very much different than my dad and my grandfather's generation, that sort of thinks, we come to this country, we appreciate everything it provides for us, but there's a belief that there is a temporary citizenship, that there are strings attached, that you don't ruffle any feathers, that you question the government, or you because these people are coming from countries where they have lived through dictatorship, and so they're afraid to be fully part of that system. But for us, we have partaken and believe that this is our country, and our citizenship is not conditional, and it is important for us to fulfill whatever that American dream was that our parents promised us when we were coming to this country. I remember when we first arrived, we landed in LaGuardia and we're driving through Manhattan, and I remember seeing the first homeless person that I've seen my entire life, and this was in America. And I remember turning to my father and be like, "This doesn't look like the America you promised." And my dad was like, "You ask too many questions. We will get to the America I promised. Just hold on." But for me, it was seeing that there was a disconnect between the American exceptionalism that we export to other parts of the world and the American reality that many Americans are living in. And as I questioned them over the years, they've always said, all of these gains that this country has made, everything that you've seen in those orientation tapes in that refugee camp, all of those progresses have been made because people have gotten involved. They rolled up their sleeves, they didn't just complain. And so now you have a role to do that. And I believed in that, and this is how I'm here now.
Yeah, Millie, one of the points that Ilhan just so eloquently illuminated has to do with some of the barriers that remain, particularly for both immigrant communities and people of color. And it's true that post-secondary education attainment has risen for all millennials, but there are still sharp disparities between racial and ethnic groups, with Hispanic and Black millennials falling behind their Asian and white counterparts. Now, under your leadership as president, California State University Fullerton became second in the nation for awarding bachelor's degrees to Hispanics, sixth in the nation for graduating students of color. Those are obviously extraordinary achievements. And now, in your new role as president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, I'd like to ask, what lessons do you hope to impart on other institutions?
Well, let me begin by saying it's an honor to be chosen to be the new president of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. Because if you read the Chetty study from Stanford that talks about upward mobility, it's those institutions that move students from one socioeconomic to another. And so it is an honor. And as I served as president of Cal State Fullerton, it is about becoming a student-centered institution that has an intentional and comprehensive plan, that has benchmarks and accountabilities for everyone at that institution. I told my campus, and it was over 40,000 as I left, that everyone that works at a state college and university like Fullerton is an educator, and that we are focused on student success, and deans and everyone else was held accountable. We had things like high impact practices, which is engaged learning, engaging students in their learning. It is about ensuring that we understand where our students are coming from. What areas are they coming from? What is their background? What are their capabilities? And having the data and capability to monitor that by every division and ensuring that people are held accountable in doing that for our students. It is about creating an environment where students have the support and that people are cared for and loved, that they feel that they can succeed in that institution. It is also about showing students how it all connects. When you're poor and you're immigrant, you're thinking about your professional career. Yes, you're learning, but we as educators help students fall in love with learning. And so for student success is showing them, this is what you're doing, this is how it connects for you for the rest of your lives. And then working on that with them to pick something that fills their heart and moves on so that when they graduate, the institutions are still connected, which is something that we have to do better in higher education, so that students understand they can come back for relearning, because learning is happening so quickly and change is happening so quickly, that that institution is there for them, and that they move forward with an understanding that learning is always, that you have to continuously learn, as all of these positions are moving so rapidly. And as I left, that's what was happening in every division of the college, working collaboratively and working with students and family. It is about building community and providing a fabulous academic experience. And that's what state colleges and universities do across the country.
Jasmine, on this topic, I have a bit of a twofold question for you. Millennials are the largest generation in the country at more than 75 million strong. We're talking about nearly a quarter of the total U.S. population, 30% of the voting age population, and 2/5 of the working age population. Do you believe that millennials have fully grasped and embraced the power of their influence? And in what ways would you say concerns might be different in Houston than, say, Atlanta or Boston and across various racial and ethnic groups? Or are they the same?
Yeah, so I think young people are paying attention. Millennials are paying attention. We are being the change that we want to see. That's how Young Invincibles got started. We saw a problem for millennials, and we created a resolution and started an organization and have continued to work with young adults to do so. There's a lot of instances, if you look back on the 2016 election, millennials were, leading Senator Sanders' campaign. Recently, from the 2012 to the 2016 election, we increased our voting percentages over 3%. Yes, we can do more, but we're still turning out more than previous years. If you look at a lot of the big movement, like with the Dreamers or Black Lives Matter, young people are at the forefront of those movements. We're the first generation, a lot of my friends and I, we talk about, we're like the first generation who knew life before the internet and are currently adjusting to it. So there's a lot of hashtag activism. And we're very active on social media. And this has given us a chance to kind of tell our stories, and ignite change that way. And a lot of the issues that we work on, we're able to reach a lot of young adults and have them tell their stories, have them testify to policies. And over the last couple of years, we've actually seen policy change as a result of young adults sharing, issues that they're facing, and having other young adults saying, "Oh, me too." Well, not the same movement, but also me too. I share this issue. I want to tell my story, and here's a way that we can change it. Like just last year, we had young adults in California share their experiences with food access as low-income students. So now there was recently a law passed where low-income students can use their SNAP benefits on campus now. So previously, if you were a low-income student, you had to leave campus to go get food. And now, just from young adults saying, I'm a low-income student, this is an issue, I'm sharing my story, now legislation has passed. So I think we're definitely starting to see our power. We like to bring a lot of young adults to the table. The young woman I mentioned, who's an entrepreneur earlier, when she shared her story, she got to meet Vice President Biden and tell him how, as a young entrepreneur, how having access to healthcare literally has changed her business life. So we're starting to see how we can use that power and really starting to use it.
I think that all of your points also in some ways touch upon some of the key differences between the millennials and other generations. And one thing that we heard about in the report is that millennials are uniquely positioned in some ways to bridge the gap between themselves and an older generation. I wanted to ask all of you to reflect on how you think that millennials can bridge that gap across generations. Why don't we start with you?
I think it is, like I said earlier, and it's the first generation that is growing up in a very diverse world. And I think we see how these policies and politics and the intersectionality of it is affecting all of us. And so we are able to not only feel the impact of a particular policy might have on me as an individual, but we are able to also respond to that me too of someone else, right? We are able to sort of recognize that my ability to succeed is tied to someone else's ability to succeed, that this is a country, a world where all of us are going to need each other to be able to be the best that we can be. And I think our generation sees that more than other generations has.
you know, as I read about the millennials who care about communities and care about the public good, it is them who is going to help others understand that and educate when baby boomers and others are open to learning about how to engage together in those communities and also understand the rapidly changing world that's happening with technology and internet. I mean, many of us actually hire millennials to help us in our organizations, let's be clear. And how do we do the social media, and how do you reach the public, and how do we reach students, for example? So when at our colleges and universities, we hire them to really talk about how do you connect with the emerging student population? How do you get to speak to them? How do you give them emergency warnings? Because they are not reading the email. And they are doing Snapchat and Facebook, and not even Facebook anymore, Twitters, et cetera. And they're the ones that are teaching us how to adjust to a rapidly changing world.
Jasmine, I'll give you a quick last word, and then we're going to open it up to some
Oh,
questions.
I just second all that. I think definitely us being at the table where decisions are being made is very, very important, and just being engaged. So baby boomers are now, becoming reliant on us. A lot of us are starting to take care of our parents and older generation. So I think it's important that we all work together to do so.
Thank you. We are going to open the floor to questions, and we have some mics. What I'll do is I'll take a couple of questions at a time in the interest of us being able to get as many as we can, and then we can kind of distill them among the guests. Okay, Sarah in the front with the glasses. And
Yeah, thank you for your
please,
presentation.
please also introduce yourself. Before
Oh,
the
Howard
question. Thank
Marks. I live here in the district, and I'm also very interested in Hispanic population and been to Mexico. My question's for Dr. Garcia. So at what point is a tipping point where Spanish becomes not just a discretionary language, but that we become like Canada, Quebec, becomes mandatory bilingual? Here in the district, in the metro, as you probably know, we have announcements in Spanish and in English. In the district government, forms are required now to be bilingual. So at what point do we make this mandatory? Thank you.
I think that's coming, and it's already here in California. The reality is in California, it is a bilingual state, if they want to say that or not. And if you walk around, all the forms, everything is happening. It's going to happen. There's a lot of resistance. We are the only country, as we go around the world, that we are monolingual. And yet we are really transforming this country, and we are going to have to embrace Spanish and other languages, quite frankly, as the millennials come into our population. It's happening in our schools. I just told you an example that we did in California, all in Spanish. We did one in Vietnamese in our community because we have a large Vietnamese population in that community, and so we did things in Vietnamese. And so if we are really serious about engaging students and engaging this new America, it's going to happen.
The gentleman in the front, and then the lady who, let's start with him, and then we'll go back there if we can.
Sandy Apgar, CSIS. First, a commendation to Representative Omar. Your story is so powerful. Hope it's communicated widely, and perhaps you'll be in the gallery, State of the Union tonight. Perhaps not, but should be. Question to Dr. Frey, if I may. Does any of your demographic data show the indicators of innovation, entrepreneurship among the millennials that will give us indicators from the demographics of how to project and predict from them?
Yeah, we didn't cover that in this report, and it's something that other people have. I mean, I think especially people talk about immigrants in the U.S. and the very high level of small business ownership and startups and so forth is really where a lot of the action is. And I think, a lot of that really reflects the millennial generation. But in the report, we really didn't get into that very much.
Right, we've got a question. She's wearing a scarf.
Thank you. Thank you for a great discussion. My name is Jenna Tomasello. I'm with the American Youth Policy Forum and also co-founder of a nonprofit organization called Learn Together, Live Together that is aiming to rebrand and reinvigorate a movement around school diversity to promote diverse, equitable, and inclusive schools for all kids. And so, Dr. Garcia, you touched on this a bit around the resource inequity in schools, and I wonder if the panel can also touch on the role of reducing residential and school segregation in terms of bridging these gaps.
That's a great question.
Is it very question?
Why don't do we want to do a couple of?
Yeah,
Okay,
couple
and the
of
gentleman
more.
right next to her, and then we can try and do these together maybe.
My name is Don Dakin. I'm a retired lawyer. Can someone tell me about the numbers reflecting millennials' voting pattern? Not patterns, but just voting relative to the other groups.
Oh, what percentage?
I don't have one.
Great. Why don't we, does anyone want to tackle any one of these before we?
Just for the voting, I know from 2012 to 2016, millennials in general went up 3%, have voted 3% more than the previous election. But in certain populations, there were decreases. Like, for instance, the HBCU population had decreased. So I think overall we're more engaged, but there's definitely barriers across the country for different segments of the population and different policies, whether it's like progressive electoral politics and same-day election and different stuff like that. But in general, millennials are more engaged in voting.
And then I think there are pockets within the country where millennials are voting at a higher number than others. Like, for example, in my district, in historically young people under the age of 35, the highest number was 123. And in my race, we increased that to over like 5,000. So,
And Amelia,
depending on where you are.
do you want to reflect on the question about desegregation?
You know, this is an issue that has been going on for a very long time, where the schools are not being very equitable. And it is about when the public pushes our elected officials in actually dealing with what's happening in our school systems. And it is about communities coming together. We have these elected officials in our cities and in our states that are not making education a priority. And yet this is the asset for this country. And yet we as citizens are not as angry as we should be when we walk into some of these schools and see the conditions of some of the schools in some of these cities. And so what we need to do is come together, not only the millennials, but all of us, in speaking out about why it's important to have strong foundations of schools in our communities, why resources are needed, and really vote out those that are not supporting our school system, especially our public school systems. Because what's happening is, and I come from California where you see the haves and have-nots, you're starting to see people sending their kids to private school, and low income and students of color are going to the public with the less resources.
Right there in the back in the black, and then maybe we'll take two. Does anyone else take one question from the? We'll take yours, and then in the glasses there. That would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Chelly Sandoval, professor at UDC, first generation. My family, my parents are immigrants. I'm from California. I had two questions. Teaching at UDC, the only public school here, my students really care about female empowerment, female leadership, and I can see that in front of us we do have a group of females. There was one question directed to this, not this panel, but the one before. But to me, like, this represents female leadership for the future, and we see different generations, different groups of people. So if you could please talk about female leadership and mentorship, what got you there. And secondly, also research. I'm teaching all my classes. I teach civics and technology courses, and I'm teaching them about research and finding scholarly journal articles, and some of these students are reading them for the first time. But it's really important to have research of the people who we're looking at, which are those minorities, to also create those types of research as well, which is scarce in the academic world. So if you could talk about those 2 points, thank you.
Great. And then I'm going to also take that question, and then we can go ahead.
Hi, my name's Patty Rose, and I've been reading a lot lately about artificial intelligence and the impact it's going to have on the future of our economy and jobs or joblessness. And I'd like your comments on how you see moving forward in terms of the conversation about the changing nature of work and what kind of impact that's going to have on the work that all of you are doing.
Great. Well, why don't we start with the question of, I think we,
She's had her hand up, I think you were saying.
okay, we think we're going to start on the question. We're just running really short on time, sorry, but hopefully if anyone else has questions, we can, at the end, you can maybe come up and ask. Start on the question of female leadership and mentorship, which I think is especially pertinent with a great group of women on stage.
So I will say that Bill's study shows that women millennials are being educated at a higher rate than men. That has both pluses and minuses. That's number one. But number two, it is about mentorship. I am a first-generation college student, and it was Caucasian men who are faculty members who saw something in me. And that's why I'm so passionate about how do you create those environments for women and underrepresented individuals to give them the mentorship, the support, and the guidance needed in order to move forward. And so all of our colleges, state colleges and universities, for example, have women leadership centers. They have centers for women who go into those professions, by the way, that are not normally women. May that be engineering, or may that be finance, or may that be computer science and technology, so that we are encouraging women to go into STEM fields and fields that are not necessarily the ones that we go into, and then we have women leadership programs. And so all our state colleges and universities at our organization are focusing on that, but at the same time understanding that there is a crisis with men of color, and that we have to pay attention to our men of color and low-income men in order to ensure that they are graduating and also being productive citizens in our country.
Do any of you have
What was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
research?
Oh, yeah.
About civic engagement?
But women empowerment.
Research by like the minority groups that haven't been in academia mostly, so who haven't mostly published in journals. And you can even talk about open source journals now and how those are slowly, changing publishing and how.
So I would share with you the Association for the Study of Higher Education, I'm sure you're aware of, has many researchers of color who are doing research on exactly that, on not only women's empowerment, but retention and graduation of students of color. And so it's all out there. What we need to do is, in addition to the research, is to get the practical word out of the research journals into the public sphere, so that the public understands what is going on with the research, so the policy and practice are out there, and the public understands what is happening with our students in school systems.
Maybe Jasmine and Ilhan, as people who are involved in policy, you can reflect on the question about, you said, so artificial intelligence and technology and the way in which it's changing the economy, and what does that mean for the millennial generation in terms of access to jobs? And what will it mean?
There's definitely a change.
That's what it will mean.
There's a shift in workforce issues, and I think we've definitely seen there's sometimes even a mismatch between like higher education and the workforce, and we've got that from talking to millennials that like I've got this credential, but it's still not a good match for the current workforce. So we've been working a lot on apprenticeships and changing like internships experiences and allowing millennials to get the actual experience working. Like I went to a co-op university, Northeastern, in Boston, where it allows you to actually work full-time during your experience. So I think changing some of the policy models and shifting examples where young adults can get co-op experience to kind of be a better match is definitely some ideas on the policy side.
I think we just have to reimagine, start working on policies and be innovative and reimagine what workplaces should look like and how people should be utilized. I was in Tallinn, Estonia, not too long ago, and it's a small country, not compared to ours, but like they are moving towards a model of making sure that their people, their humans, are are utilizing their ability to contribute, to society in a different way. And I think there are a lot of models in different parts of the world that we can learn from to kind of see what happens as we grow in this sphere. How do we create different spaces for people?
And it also is about continuous learning, and how do we teach students that it's not about a particular skill. It's about being creative, about learning how to be innovative, about being critical thinkers, about knowing how to work with differences and knowing how to deal with ambiguity, and providing that kind of education. So as the world changes, you're rapidly changing with it and not afraid of the change. And that is something that we have to do in our educational systems.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, Amelia, Jasmine, and Ilhan, and as well as another thank you to Brookings.